Hi there, KA0KAO, Cobblecraft. We're going to go a little bit out of the norm here today. We're going to talk about radios again, but from a different perspective. So usually I'm trying to get to the very basics and tell you a few things that don't involve math and things like this. We may get a little mathy in this one, but for a good reason. I hope you'll hang around and appreciate it. Uh, One of the subscribers here, Jeffrey Myers, had a really good question. He says, can you tell us the advantages and disadvantages of ham versus GMRS? And that's a pretty profound question when you stop to think about it, because why would you want to go out and get a license? And I'm going to try and answer that as best I can here. It may take us more than my usual 15 minutes. So if that's a question that's really um, high on your priority list, great. If not, then I'm sure there's other stuff to listen to out there. But let's start first on a very basic level and talk about the differences between ham and GMRS or any of the unlicensed bands. Let's just do that. First of all, you're looking at me through my phone. In my very first video about GMRS, um, I was talking about that being a radio, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but that is a radio. A lot of you out there have a radio telephone with 5G network. And if you understand what's going on there, then that will help you understand how we get to the answer for Jeffrey's question. So let's think about how this radio in your pocket works. Let's talk about just a 5G network. That's kind of the latest craze. So what does 5G mean? That means that it's operating on a radio band that is 11 millimeters, which, what does that mean? You know, we're all here on the English system and we're thinking inches and so on, but I can tell you real easy what 11 millimeters is. This is, I have my rifle with me because it's Iowa and I'm outdoors. This is, let's see if I can get in here, a 300 blackout round. That's a 7.62 millimeter diameter on that bullet. And compare it to my finger. If I put two of those together, I'm going to have about 15 millimeters. So roughly about the size of my finger. And we're talking 11 millimeters. So that means when this radio wave leaves your phone, just like the rings on a pond when you drop a pebble in, those waves move out there and they're going to be 11 millimeters apart. Okay, well that's cool. And the reason that you like your phone so well over a little handheld radio like this UV5R is that when you touch that button to call a friend, they pick it up at the other end. But why is that? That's where we have to start thinking about this if we want to answer Jeffrey's question. So, you've noticed all these new 5G towers coming up and they're on the horizons all over the place. Well, they're on a horizon for a reason because that thing's out there listening. That tower is sitting there just waiting for you to touch the send button, the PTT on your phone, that little green button. And when it hears that, it starts pulling in your signal and it switches it on down the line to get to your friend's phone. Nothing magical about it. It's no different than picking up your UV5R, except you know your friend's going to have his phone closer to him than his UV5R. This thing may be sitting in a drawer somewhere waiting for somebody to say, hey, let's go out and play radios. That's just basically what's going on here. So let's move on a little bit. When we get into Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, those things are working. Let me just switch pages here. Those things are about 125 millimeters, so about 5 inches roughly, I suppose. GMRS, that's our big question. Where is that stuff? So you know that it happens to be at 462.725, for instance. I think that's what, 22, channel 22 on GMRS. Or if you push the PTT button, it sends out at 467.725. And that is roughly 650 millimeters. So now those little waves are getting further apart, uh, which does affect how they work. Um, won't get into much more of that. Let's move on. Let's talk about some other things. Let's say MERS. You guys familiar with MERS at all? Because that's going to help us in our equation about whether we want to bother with getting a license down the road. MERS is another unlicensed uh, radio band, which means a series of frequencies that the FCC has, out of the generosity and kindness of their heart, set aside for us to use. And those very frequencies are around 1972 millimeters, so 1.9 meters. You know what a meter is? We talk about yards here in America. A yard is 36 inches. A meter is roughly 39 inches. So we're at 1.9. We're almost 2 meters. If you know anything about ham radio, now we say, oh, well, that's VHF. 2 meters is VHF. MERS is very close to VHF, but it's unlicensed. And the rules behind it are that you can't operate with a radio that has a removable antenna or whatever it is, and you have to use only like 2 watts and stuff like this. So we'll get into more of that as we move on. And then CB. Everybody's probably familiar with CB. It's kind of gone by the wayside, and that's why I've even had videos about GMRS, is because it's popular right now. When I was a kid, which was 60 years ago or so, um, they had CB radios was all the rage, and everybody sat in their driveway talking to all their friends at school and everything. It was a big deal. Uh, that was 11 meters. So we're talking, roughly 11 yards out there. And now you get some of the math behind that. That's how far apart these radio waves are when we drop the pebble into the pond. When you push that PTT, those radio waves start moving out from that antenna. Bing, bing. Of course, they're going at the speed of light, not bing, bing. But that's the general idea. And how those waves propagate makes a big difference out there in the radio world as far as receiving. So let me switch back to page 1 again. Um, when we're talking about GMRS, it's a really effective radio for especially short distances and line of sight communication. We talked about this in our first and second video about GMRS. You can go back and review those, but the general idea is you need to be able to have line of sight with that radio to really be effective. And that may be that you can see it over there, or it may be that, hey, it's off in the distance on that hilltop and I'd have to get binoculars to see it. But the principle's the same. So line of sight, that radio wave goes out there. It may be hindered by stuff in the way. I'm in a beautiful Iowa forest right now, and GMRS, well, he's not too thrilled about getting through all these leafy green stuff here. It's all full of moisture and there's dew on them. It's dripping on me while I'm talking. That's the nature of this UHF band, the ultra high frequency bands like GMRS and 440 for the ham guys. It's not real thrilled about getting through all this wet stuff. Now, if I take this same radio and I use MERS in the same circumstance from the same sitting position with a friend who's somewhere else in the woods, it's actually significantly more effective through this particular stuff. And I don't know the details about why, but also it has to do with hills and valleys and stuff. The VHF MERS frequencies for the unlicensed uh, will kind of wrap around the hills a little better, dip into the valleys a little better than GMRS, a little better than line of sight. But once you get past that, we're starting to hurt. So let me see what else we might talk about. We might say, well, then let's see what the CB does. So CB radio is really effective for long distance. You know, back in the day, they used to kind of pirate their radios. They'd put a little more power in them than they're supposed to have, and maybe some different type crystal, whatever. I don't remember all that stuff, and it's way over my head anyway. But I've heard of people talking on the 11 meter band, the CB band, in ways that you wouldn't expect. I had a friend of mine who was a trucker, and propagation just happened to be right that day where he was on the single sideband of his CB radio, and he was in Wisconsin, and he's talking to somebody over in California. I'm like, what? How in that? What? That can't happen, right? But it can. And that's kind of the magic behind radio propagation, is that as those waves start to get further and further apart, um, line of sight communication is less important, because now these things will bounce around off of stuff. And I don't understand exactly why. But for instance, what he was using was um, ionized particles in the atmosphere were actually bouncing his radio waves off the atmosphere somewhere and back down into California. That's ridiculous, right? But that's what high frequency radio communication is all about. It's about using those types of things. They bounce them off satellites, they bounce them off the moon sometimes. It's just crazy how when somebody's intent on communicating with someone else, then they can send these things up there, bounce them down, and come back. I had a friend who lived in Australia, and he actually was able to bounce his communication all the way around the world, and it came back, and he heard it. He was doing the Morse code, and he's whatever it was, and he comes around, and bang, he hears it a few seconds later in his headphones. So it's a weird thing that's going on. But back again, communication. Communication is the answer to Jeffrey's question, because if I am intent on communicating with someone, then you're not going to find a better tool than this thing right here, that phone, because it's always got antennas who are just waiting to hear you call, and they're anxious to switch that communication over to your friend's phone, and here it goes. There's no necessity behind calling your buddy or sending him a mail, a letter, and saying, hey, let's be on the air on June 6th of 2023 at 7 p.m. and let's talk. You don't have to do that. You just push that little green button and off it goes. But emergencies happen. What if I'm out here walking around and I fall? There's all kinds of rocky ledges around where I'm at here, up in these hills. If I fall and break my leg and my phone happens to be in that pocket, I could easily break my phone. Now what do I do? If I pick up my little UV5R, the chances of somebody being within line of sight communication for me are slim. I may not be able to reach anybody trying to get out on that. I could try GMRS, because I have it programmed in here, but it's not licensed for this radio. And maybe that would be tough. It would certainly reach out of here better than what GMRS does, but what am I going to do? There's probably nobody sitting at their coffee table going, gee, I'm just going to set it to GMRS Blue and see if anybody calls. The chances are very, very slim. But there's some repeaters around here, ham repeaters. And I can reach two of them from in here. If I could claw my way to the top of one of these hills, then I could set it for B-Town, or I could set it for the 240 in Dubuque, and I could call out, and there's usually somebody sitting by a radio in one of those two. Within an hour, I'd have contact, and I'd probably have somebody sending an ambulance out to me. So that's the idea. There's communication for emergencies. Now, beyond that emergency, let's talk about that high frequency stuff. I can take a little $400 radio and I can string a wire out from it, maybe hang it in a tree, and I can talk around the world on less than 20 watts. This thing, you guys familiar with it? 8 watts on the higher, more expensive models, 8 watts. I've talked to California from here in Iowa on less than 8 watts. I've talked to the East Coast on less than 8 watts on the ham bands. Now, mind you, those are not 11 meters like the CB band. The bands I was talking on were 20 and 40 meters, those type of things. And There's always somebody out there, some ham anxious to talk to somebody else. So when I call out CQ, CQ, um, which is code and means, hey, any station out there that wants to talk, um, they're going to call back. And in an emergency situation, that's pretty useful. I had a buddy, the same guy that talked around the world, was driving through, I think it was Minnesota during a snowstorm, him and his sister, and they were truckers. And they their truck froze up or something. It was like 40 below, whatever it was. It was some ridiculous cold. And he got on his ham radio and he talked to a guy in Florida. This is like 2 in the morning. And he convinced him that, hey, this is real. Here's the number that I need you to call, and you're going to tell them this number. And pretty soon they got somebody up there to rescue him. That ham radio saved his life in that emergency. So, that's the way these things work. So then we come back again to Jeffrey's question, what's the advantage of this license? If I could do that same thing on 11 meter, then great. The problem is radio propagation with the shorter waves, 11 meters down here into 2 meters, all that stuff. It doesn't propagate off of the particles in the atmosphere very well. Once in a while, you'll get 11 meters to do that. And right now, the sun being in this incredible cycle it's in here in 2023, it's amazing what you can do on 10 meters, which is a ham band, 11 meters, which is a CB. Um, it's amazing what's going on out there right now. So this, if you want to get a license, now's the time, because the sun is just really doing cool things with our atmosphere and letting you talk a lot. So I would encourage that. But that's the other reason. There's two reasons basically. One is emergency communication. When that phone isn't working, then here's the ham bands. But the other reason would be it's a heck of a hobby. It's fun. There are contests out there and stuff like that. There's good people to teach you how to do all this stuff. There's just all kinds of fun electrical things you can do, and antenna building. It becomes a hobby in and of itself. I'm not per se into that, but I do some of that so that my skills can be honed in an emergency. Because radios, as I've told you before, are a skill. It's not like picking up your phone, punching the button, putting a number in if we have to, if it's not in our address book, and then that's about the extent of it. No, with radios, you have to know what you're propagating to where, and roughly who's going to pick up at the other end. You have to be ready for things. It takes some preparation, some planning, and you have to have the right equipment for the right task and all these things. So I'm not sure if that has answered Jeffrey's question, uh, but to reiterate, I think getting a ham license is a great thing. If you're not particularly interested in getting a license, there's a lot of good unlicensed bands out there. We've talked about FRS, GMRS. Now you've talked about MERS a little bit. We've talked about CB. These are essentially unlicensed bands. Now, GMRS, obviously, you need a license for it. CB, you were supposed to get a license back in the day. I don't know if anybody really checks on it, but that's the principle here. If you don't mind calling your friends and arranging to get on the radio with them and do this testing. I have some friends that they love to play radios, so it's no big deal. We'll go out and we'll play radios for a day or something, or we'll communicate via the phone and say, hey, can you help me with a test? Yeah, we'll help you. Let me get to my rig. And that's an easy chore. But in an emergency situation, you're not going to have that. And those unlicensed bands may be filled with chatter. Whereas when you get into the licensed bands, there's a certain way to communicate, and that's why everybody talks about the sad hams. They have their certain ways of communicating, and they have that for a reason, so that when the bands are jammed with traffic, with radio communication, they can still get the word out. And we practice that with our ham club, for emergency radio. There's a thing called ARES, amateur radio emergency something, obviously. I don't remember what the S is, but that is all we do in that club, is talk about radio communication in emergencies, and we plan for it and prepare for it and test for it. And We don't know if we'll ever be able to use it per se, but if the police department calls us and, hey, we need to set up a search perimeter, somebody's lost out there, some 2-year-old, and we'd have to start blazing through the woods, we'd bring our radios and we help them set up people. It's just that type of an idea. It's a hobby, or it's emergency, or whatever. So if that helps you any, I hope that you'll drop me a like or a subscribe, and be sure and give me your comments. If I've screwed up any of the math here, don't be afraid to tell me. I can take it. Hope you all have a good one. KA0, KAO will be clear.